Hi, everybody. Welcome to Health and the Family Week number 8. The Sociology of Health and the Family Week number 8. I hope you're all doing all right as we're moving toward the final few weeks of the course. Again, let me know if you feel like you need a bit of a break or some breathing room from too much of the work that we may be doing. I don't want to overload you, so I'm happy to listen to what you have to say about the direction that we're going and so on. Last week, if I remember correctly, we were looking at modes of stratification, what I was calling modes of stratification. And we looked at gender as a gender mode of stratification. We were looking at social economic status or class as a mode of stratification. This week, we're going to develop that a little bit more. We're going to go into a bit more depth to look more on the ground at how this stuff is playing out, particularly among working class families, particularly working class parents and children, by looking at their well-being and what's going on there in terms of their class as defined. Remember when we were talking about social economic status as having various indicators such as income, occupation, education? Well, we're going to be looking particularly at working class families who have lower education and who are working a particular occupation category that we would associate with something like working class or working poor perhaps as well, and we'll see how we can make that distinction. So for this week we were looking at 3 chapters from the textbook, if you're following along in the textbook, chapter 29, 30, and 32. So I'm going to be pulling and culling from these chapters at kind of freely. Chapter 29 is titled Work in the Working Class Family, Work in the Working Class, Challenges Facing Families. Chapter 30 is Non-Standard Work, and I like that expression. We'll come back to it, non-standard work, and childcare needs of low-income parents. And chapter 32, which you can really just look at as a way of framing all of this within a global perspective, is titled Global Transformations in Work and Family. So I want to begin by tracing the broad trends, which we should already be familiar with because I've been saying it in various ways in this course already. There's really just 2 that I want to bring your attention to. The first, and again, we've been discussing it here and there in this course, has to do with transformations that have occurred in the, let's call this broad trends. In the composition of the paid labor force. Broadly, we can say that men entered into wage or salary work in very large numbers very quickly, in fact, in the early 19th century. So we're talking about the early 1800s, right? So the early part of the 1800s. Well, it didn't happen all at once. So I want to kind of revise what I just said. It didn't happen all at once. It's happening kind of slowly as people are moving from, say, a more agrarian mode of production toward a more moving toward an industrial form of capitalism, which comes with all kinds of different things, including people moving to the cities, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So, but it really happened. Men were entering into wage and salary work over the course of about 100 years. So we can think maybe from around 1830 to 1930, which brings us to the 20th century. As we know, not long after that, in the middle part of the 20th century, around the time of the Second World War and shortly after, of course, women were entering the labor force much more quickly compared to how the speed at which men were entering salary and wage labor. Women were now doing it much more quickly, and according to some estimates, at least 2 times as quickly as men originally entered the labor force. So one of the key changes that this signals, of course, is the transformation of the gender division of labor, which we've talked about quite a bit in this course. Gender was once, as you know, a major factor in the composition of the division of labor. And then what happened was that there was a pretty dramatic transformation in roles having to do with childcare. As soon as women are entering the labor force, childcare becomes more of a privatized industry, you might say, and it becomes more of a problem, something now that we have to think more and more about. So I don't want to keep this as a simple sort of, or a typical sociology class by discussing it simply at this level, which is what you kind of expect from a course like this. I want to go a bit deeper and be a bit more innovative by suggesting to you that the change that happened here when childcare moved out of the home and the gender division of labor has changed, it has something to do with social relationships in space and time. And this is a claim that we're not going to be used to hearing, and we're not going to read it in a lot of places, particularly not in a lot of studies that might ground a lot of courses such as this one. So take, for example, that when women entered the labor force, the relationships to children, the interactions that occurred within the family also changed in space and time. So those social relationships changed in space and time. Well, we could say how. And one of the ways we can answer it is perhaps to think about it topologically or spatially, by producing a diagram. And maybe I'll do that in a second. I think I will, in fact. Well, parents, by working away from home, increased their separation from the children. That occurred across both genders, but of course to a relative degree. And this gave rise to the spatial and temporal separation from children and family members. In other words, children were now cared for increasingly outside of the home. I mean, I want to encourage you to think about this in terms of social relationships in space and time, and not simply in terms of a narrative about how childcare was exported out of the home. I mean, take a simple diagram. I'm going to try and diagram it. I'm not sure I can fully do it to my satisfaction, kind of on whim here, but I'm going to try anyway. Let's say time one, which is an earlier period of time. Let's say roughly from the 1830s, probably quite a bit after that, 1830s-ish to around the 1930s, 1940s, something like that. We have what we've been calling a patriarchal, or if you like, more traditional gendered division of labor. And we can say this is time one. Roughly, again, I'm not happy with this date that I'm giving you, but just roughly like mid-19th century to mid-20th century, you have this situation where you have, let's say, the family. So this circle here will designate the family, and the family is inside the circle to some extent. You have the mother. Again, it's a gendered division of labor, so the mother is within the home. And this is a heterosexual division of labor as well, of course. The mother's inside the home. The child is also inside the home. I don't know really how to diagram this as well as I want. Maybe I'm going to do a different color so that you can really see the child here as purple. Okay. So the mother's looking after the child. Maybe something like this. It's not exactly, I mean, we're not going to have exact precision with this, but just so that we can kind of imagine it spatially. And the father, of course, is out in the world of work, the work world, working for a particular amount of time. And the father will be designated by blue here. And the child is kind of, so it looks something like this. The father's the worker. So I think this diagram shows somewhat naively, I admit. It's quite naive. It's not as precise as I'd like it to be. It's more to give a sort of visual representation or a topological consideration of parenting in space and time within the patriarchal or gendered division of labor. You know, the mother looked after the child and the housework and was relatively attached to the father, who spatially was much to the child. Well, the father was much more sort of spatially, at least, distant for a certain amount of time outside of the family or home in the workplace, shown here. So work times and schedules here were mostly dictated by supervisors and managers outside of the home. So you have a work schedule that's managed over here, right, by the world, by your employers and bosses and managers. So there's this external schedule imposed upon workers from without, and that time also dictated the time of the family and the time that the father could spend with the family and these sorts of things, right? So let's consider that time one. Time two would be something like, I don't know, we have more gender differentiation or transformation of the division of labor, say, after World War II. Just after the mid part of the 20th century, that's the greater than sign meaning after, not greater than World War II, but after World War II. And what changes here? Well, let's see if I can kind of draw something and then we can sort it out. Again, my drawing's not going to be perfect. It's going to look a little confusing, I'm sure. Again, we're dealing mostly with a heterosexual union here. And I'm going to do this one in a different color. I don't know, something like this anyway. The point is, I know these circles look kind of confusing. Well, if you look back at the image I drew before this one, what changes ultimately is a movement of the child outside of the home, not in the sphere of work, but in the sphere of care. So we might say all of a sudden we have like a care economy out here. So we still have an external schedule. Time is still managed by the bosses, the managers, and so on. The only difference here in time two, around the beginning, around just after the middle part of the 20th century, is that now it was regulating also women's work outside of the home. Women are now entered into the labor force, now salaried and working in higher numbers. But childcare is also becoming much more externalized now, following the schedules of the workplace, which means what? Well, it means that childcare becomes important for workers and for families. They require childcare outside of the home so that they can work. Whereas before, what we saw was something like this. I'm just gonna erase. Whereas before, what we saw was something like this, something closer to this. Now what we see is these kind of spheres moving outward. If I could animate this, I would. Looks more like this. The mother's in the world of work, father's in the world of work, and now there's this new dimension of privatized care emerging. And then what we see is what I'm calling time three. which I don't know what else to call it. I'm going to call it liquid capitalism. We've been using the word liquid here and there, the liquid family form. Let's say contemporary capitalism. We might even think about it, especially in the time of coronavirus, where we can really imagine it. I'm just going to try and draw this. I'm not even sure I can. I'm just kind of spitballing it a bit. But probably looks something like this. I don't know. Maybe we'll call this care. Again, I'm just kind of making this up on the spot, so forgive me. But we need to put the mom and the dad in here somewhere. So let's, and it's not always necessarily a mom or a dad anymore either. It's not exactly gendered within the family quite as much as it was before, and neither within the sphere of care, although there's still significant gender divisions here, of course. But you have something like, you know, it's just mother, father, child, something like that. I know these circles are looking really weird because I didn't change the colors, but the point is that it's the world of work has itself collapsed back into the sphere of the family. I know this looks like a total mess. So in our current state, recognizable mostly during the time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, although to be clear, it was moving in this direction even before the pandemic. And now we're seeing more and more articles out there and studies demonstrating that, that we're going to see much more of this type of work family intermingling in the future, where, as I showed you a moment ago, the spheres of, say, work and the family are overlapping in really odd ways, which produces consequences for children and the family. And this isn't true of all people, especially it's not true of working class people and the working poor, but it seems nonetheless to be broadening in terms of its applicability even there, especially if you're working a call center job or something like that. So again, this is based on some scarce empirical evidence, but I think that we have enough evidence to consider that there's been an implosion. If time, let's put it like this, and I'm being really theoretical here because I like doing it. If time two saw an explosion in terms of a movement of childcare outside of the family, in some private sphere, right, and a movement of women and wives and mothers into the labor force, then time two seems to, time three seems to imply what I would call an implosion, where the world of work has sort of receded into the world of the family, and everybody's kind of working from home. And there's new issues here having to do with childcare. So if time two was about explosion, then time three seems to be about implosion, proximity, time, space, change. And the schedules are now internally managed rather than externally coordinated. And these are very serious changes. Again, it's not always true of the working class and the working poor, but I think we're seeing evidence that it's becoming increasingly true even there, that this trend is broadening, and we have to be very attentive to it because it's not clear that the research is demonstrating so much about this implosion, and we're kind of on the cutting edge and theorizing about it. So we should begin to do more research on what I'm calling implosion. Another global trend that we should be aware of here, and this is the second one, I mentioned the first one earlier about women entering the labor force and so on. The other trend is of course related to this. It's urbanization of people. it also has significant repercussions for our social relationships in space and time. Like, consider that at the beginning of the 20th century, in the, let's say, early 1900s, only 18% of the world lived in urban areas. It's the early 1900s. That's actually a really high number if you think about it. That's a really high number of people living in the city. I mean, the city, urban areas are by definition areas of population density and interaction frequency, what Emil Durkheim called dynamic density, in other words, which are what those 2 points are all about. But by the end of the 1900s, what we see is that, so we're talking about the beginning of the 21st century, 50%, approximately 50% of the world lived in urban areas. That's urbanization. It's a movement. It's a growing number. Thought to be well over 60% by the year 2030, as people increasingly move to the city. And why are people moving to the city? Well, it's for employment. It's for work. And when they move, they're separating from their families, leaving their extended families and friendship networks behind. No wonder, I mean, how could we not see in this movement, this overall trajectory, a trend toward voluntary relationships and moreover, the movement toward ever increasing differentiation, up to the point at which we're all individuals without relationships beyond our employment circles, for example. And maybe that's a part of why in our most recent period of history, many of us feel alone, and loneliness is a significant problem now. We're all so disconnected from our family and friendship networks. Okay, well, what has been the effect on children and families overall? Well, there's been very serious repercussions, as we all know, on families and children. What we refer to and have been referring to as the work-family balance, challenges that are occurring at the work-family interface. Well, think about the developing world, because the developing world experiences this much more, because there are higher requirements for care, but less resources. So you need more care, but you have less resources to provide the care. I mean, I'm just thinking spontaneously. I mean, in the developing world, families tend to be larger, which means that there's more people. There tends to be more illness, so more care needs there. You get paid less, so less resources to provide the care to more people. I mean, it just kind of, at this point, it seems kind of like an obvious thing to say, I guess. Let's look a bit closer at the challenges that working class families have been facing, particularly within the Western world. Let's say in the movement of time 2 toward what I've been calling time 3. And the question is, how do working class families face the challenges of work and family life as they become new parents while juggling the demands of these multiple jobs? So this is the question that's kind of guiding us. How do working class families face the challenges of work and family life, the work-family balance, if you like, as they become new parents? And of course, what we know is that they're now juggling multiple jobs, because we're dealing in the period of time 2 toward time 3. And in the period of time 2, both parents in a heterosexual marriage are working, increasingly working. So you have dual income earners, two people who are employed in the family, often with a child. How are they managing their family life as they become new parents, as they have a child? How are they managing their well-being and the well-being of one another, including their new baby? Well, this is something that the author of chapter 29, whose name is Maureen Perry Jenkins, took up. And she's analyzing data from the Work and Family Transitions Project, the WFTP. And the goal was to examine how working class dual earner couples are experiencing this transition into parenthood while they're still holding down their jobs. Now, they might be taking a break from the job, one or two of them, while they're parenting, but they're still holding down those jobs. Their employment hasn't ceased. So how are they experiencing this transition? Well, some of us might already know anecdotally, whether we've experienced it ourselves or whether we know somebody who has, but nonetheless, we should look at the study. Let's do a quick overview of the methodology of the study first, I guess. The data was gathered from 153 working class dual earner couples who were experiencing the transition into parenthood for the first time. It's their first child. They're all heterosexual couples. Beginning in the third trimester of pregnancy is when the study began. I think they gathered most of their sample from prenatal classes at various hospitals in New England. And already, I think that should raise a few alarms for anybody who's attentive to methodological questions, because you wonder, when it's confined to a particular locale, how much of that is culturally specific. But we're just going to put that to the side, because we're much more interested in broad theoretical arguments that we can glean from the empirical evidence. So all of these people in the study were married, or they were cohabiting for at least a year prior to the beginning of the study. And by working class here, those who were involved in the study mean is that they were working a job that required an associate's degree, not a university degree, an associate's degree, let's say community college, or less. But typically not even that. It's typically a high school diploma, a job that requires a high school diploma or less, but certainly not much more than that. All of these people were working full-time, which means 32 hours per week or more, before the birth of their child, and they plan to return back to work no more than half a year after the birth of their child. They're all aged 19 to 41. They're mostly white, and I think that's a significant shortcoming of the study as well, as we can surmise. 90 to 92% of them were white. None of them had a college degree. Some of them had high school or vocational training, which includes things like training to be a truck driver, a beautician, or a mechanic. Okay, and we have some more information about them, but I'm just not going to drown you in those little details. If you want to look into it, you can check the chapter for yourself. Each parent, independently of the other parent, filled in demographic information in a short form, which indicated various things like their age, their gender, their marital status, their income, what type of job they were doing, what their work hours were, and so on. They also did 4 interviews with both partners, independent, across the transition, across various periods. So you have 4 different times at which they're being interviewed through various stages of the process of their child being born. These interviews were open-ended questions on various things like work, their psychological well-being, their assessments of their marital relationship, questions about various social supports they might be receiving, questions about gender roles, and so on. And what they found was that most men, the most common jobs that the men were, I'll just break out of this, the most common jobs that the men were involved in were factory workers, truck drivers, food service workers, and most of the women were food service workers, factory workers, beauticians. Okay, let's move on to the findings. The research demonstrated that shift work, and we can talk more about shift work before the end of today, but shift work is much more common in working class occupations. So research demonstrates that shift work tends to be much more common in working class occupations. Working class, again, defined in terms of various social economic measures, such as income level, occupation type, and education level. So they're much more likely to be engaged in shift work. They are also, as blue collar workers, working class employees, they're much more likely to be working on call, be working rotating shifts, and so on, much more so than, say, middle class workers or upper middle class employees. And this is especially true of those who are in the service sector, in occupations like food service workers, police officers, firefighters, security guards, factory workers, and so on. So why is all of this concerning from a family health perspective? Well, shift work is linked to greater marital instability. It's also linked, of course, to various negative health outcomes, mental health outcomes, but we're not necessarily discussing that today. It's also linked to, engaging in shift work is also linked to perceptions of lower quality marriages. People are less happy in their marriage. Depression is very much correlated with shift work, especially during the first year of parenthood. So it's very dangerous from a clinical standpoint, especially when we hear things like depression. That's very dangerous thing to think about. As a clinician, the first thing I think of when I think of parents who are working shift work, who are therefore depressed, is the incredible taxing mental health issues that are going to be inherited by those children. I mean, I'm not going to get into it today, although it's a topic I get really excited about because the research is really interesting here and the theory is really interesting. But for a long time, it was thought that a depressed caregiver, a depressed parent, produces, in terms of developmental outcomes in early children, produces children who refuse seeking out care from their parents. They retreat from the care of their parents. And this in turn implies that they never need to take up things like language to install within themselves their own desires and so on. It can be linked to various forms of psychoses and serious forms of mental health traumas and difficulties. So it's a very striking thing when we hear about shift work and the correlation with depression from a clinical perspective. But what's happening here at the level of childcare? Well, the study demonstrates that most new parents actually prefer, whether it's good for them or not, they prefer having alternate shifts among the various parental figures. Like, to put it simply, if I were in a relationship with a child, I might prefer to work at a certain time while my partner stays at home, and then I go out to work, and then I stay home, and my parent and my partner goes out to work, and we sort of alternate in that way. And the reason that a lot of working class people seem to prefer that is because childcare costs are very high, and obtaining childcare subsidies can be quite difficult. And so this can relieve those significant burdens. If we could sort of tag team childcare, we don't really get to see each other that much, but if we can sort of tag, you're it, you go work, and I'll take care of the child for a while, we can reduce our financial load. So you can save on the very high costs of childcare. Well, let's look specifically at mothers for a moment. The study finds that mothers report higher well-being when they are employed than those who would prefer not to work. So, at the same time, blue-collar mothers, working class mothers, tend to work because of economic necessity. Those two things might seem somewhat incompatible, but it's not necessarily the case that they're incompatible. It's not true of white-collar female workers. Where paid work and well-being is correlated among blue-collar female workers, including mothers. So studies show that working-class mothers often desire to work even if they don't require the money. I think this indicates already something that I want to go on a tangent and talk about, having to do with social relationships in space and time, and the actual perceived benefits of working to separate in space and time. But I'm just going to put that to the side. We also find that 89% of women and 81% of men preferred that women be employed before the baby is born. That's a new statistic among working class people, because when we think about the old, say, more traditional gender division of labor in, say, time one, I would imagine those statistics are going to be much lower. I'd have to go back and check, but I presume they're going to be much lower, because these statistics tend to demonstrate and amplify the ideology of the time. But these figures change at around the time of the baby's first birthday, when 49% of mothers prefer employment. That's less than half of mothers, or around half, prefer to be employed even when the child is born. But 58% of fathers prefer their wives to work. Again, we're dealing with heterosexual relationships. So this implies that there's nonetheless a desire for the mother to return home, both by mothers and fathers to some significant degree. Though more by fathers, of course, when the child is born. One of the surprising findings from this study was that mothers became more depressed. This is really surprising, and I don't know what to make of it. Maybe some of you have some ideas about it. But the surprising finding from the study was that mothers became more depressed the more that fathers performed childcare activities. It's striking. I'm not sure what to make of it. If I had more time, I'm sure I could come up with some sort of a preliminary theoretical hypothesis, but I'm just going to forgo that. We can deepen our analysis even more by looking at the Work and Family Transitions Project. Oh, the old WFTP. The study focuses on low-wage workers, particularly low and semi-skilled jobs, those that require low education. How do these employees manage the demands of work and family life? Well, we should note that the vast majority of workers in the United States work in jobs that have no authority, or sorry, no, where they have no authority. And without skills necessarily, or low skill. We often make a distinction, therefore, between the working class and the working poor. What's the difference? Well, people make this distinction in various ways. The way that the author of this chapter makes it is to draw a line based mostly upon education. The working class typically have, the working class typically have a high school degree, minimally, while the working poor tend to have some high school, but no degree. Again, this is at the time of publishing this book. I wonder if some of this has changed a little bit, but I still think the general trends are going to be mostly the same. Although at the time of COVID, I think it's important that we continue to think about time 3 and what's changing now, because I really believe we're in a process of global transformation right now, where things are, there's a certain type of implosion happening. So, you know, and we also know that the standards are also changing. Like, having a high school degree is not enough to ensure admission into the working class anymore. The working class tend to have jobs such as, I'm not sure, should I write this? Yeah, sure, why not? Machine operators, craftspeople, clerical workers, sales workers, so on. The working poor tend to have service jobs, low-paid operators, clerical work, and so on. We could even, although we don't have time to do it today, look at this through a sort of intersectional analysis by focusing on the intersection with race. There's the phrase brown collar worker, for example, which includes, particularly within the United States, immigrant workers, especially Latinos, which reminds us that social class is not at all randomly or equally distributed by gender, race, or ethnicity. For example, there's a heck of a lot of working class and working poor people of color, and we need to be attentive to those intersections. But in any case, what we want to do is look at the way in which all members of a household are linked into the labor force, to issues of class or social economic issues. We don't just want to look at one person, and this is where a lot of studies have been blinded, because as we know in time too, we have dual earning couples now. And when you have dual earning couples, you can't just study the one member of the household who's making the most amount of money, for example, or who has the highest education. You have to look at both. You have to have a more holistic analysis of the family. And it's important because the research clearly shows that there are very strong effects based upon our social class that have to do with our different parenting styles. This is really interesting. So there's a relationship between our parenting style and our social economic status. How shall I put this? Like, our mental health as parents is transmissible, obviously, to the health outcomes of our children as a sort of consequence. Studies even demonstrate that we can predict with some significant degree of success the parenting style of a couple based upon their social class. So take, for example, a study from a few decades ago, which looked at autonomy in one's employment. I'm just going to break out of this. I'm not sure how much I feel like I want to use the whiteboard today. So there was a study around a decade ago, or a couple decades ago, I should say, which looked at autonomy in one's employment, which means, you know, your ability to be self-directed, to produce your own rules, and perhaps even to some extent your own schedule. So that can occur to relative degrees, and it implies that low levels of supervision, for example, and more complexity of work tasks tend to be something more of a privilege as you climb the class ladder, the class hierarchy. So we find higher levels of self-direction and job complexity in middle and upper middle class jobs or families. Sorry, jobs. But working class jobs tend to be more routinized and have more supervision at various levels of the chain. And so there's less autonomy for those workers. So what the study found was that fathers who held jobs that had less supervision and consequently more autonomy tended also to value those traits as a parent in their children, the traits of autonomy, being self-directed, being independent, and so on. But fathers who worked lower jobs in the social economic ladder, working class jobs, these are jobs with more supervision, less autonomy, more routinized, more repetitive, more minute, and less, therefore less complex. They tend to value in their children more things like conformity, obedience, docility, for example. And this study was repeated quite a few years later. I said this was a study from a few decades ago, but it was repeated for women in the workforce. And this was in the 1990s, and the study yielded the same results. I mean, it's basically the same thing going on there among mothers. So it implies that our class position tells us something of our aesthetic tastes, our aesthetic judgments, and perhaps our moral values. In fact, yeah, I'm going to go on a little tangent, just a little tiny tangent. In fact, this was the position of a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu, a quite famous sociologist, he dead now. I mean, he passed not long ago. He wrote a book in 1979 titled Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. I think that's the title of it offhand. And in that book, he demonstrated using empirical evidence, multiple factor analyses, charts, tables, surveys, various statistical techniques. He demonstrated that based upon our various class positions, to put it simply, our social economic status, to put it very simply, we tend to value different things. We tend to have different moral positions, different attitudes about what's beautiful and what is good in the world, and so on. So, I mean, it's not just a little study like the one I mentioned before about parenting styles. There's a bigger theoretical perspective here that seems to demonstrate some truth. Here, I have a table here that I'll show you to give you a sense of a very simplified version of the type of work that Bourdieu was doing. I mean, his work was much more complex than this and much more precise, but this one is kind of a nice, fun way to understand what's going on. This is a table. And what you can see is that there's a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. The vertical axis goes up and down, right? At the top is having a lot of money. Economic capital is money, so plus means a lot of it. At the bottom means you don't have a lot of money. The other axis here is called cultural capital, and cultural capital means your access to important knowledge. You know, what do you have access to libraries? Do you have access to studies? Do you have access to information that is of very high quality or not? How much of the world around you do you know about? So it's a type of capital that has to do with access to, let's say, information in one way or another. And you can see it can go higher to the left here or lower to the right. So we have various positions here, higher and lower. You could have high economic capital and low cultural capital over top right. You can have various precise types of higher economic capital and higher cultural capital to various degrees. And you can go down here, lower economic capital and higher cultural capital in the bottom left, and so on and so on. Lower cultural capital, lower economic capital in the bottom right, but to various degrees. Like you can move more inward. Like you can have, for example, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but like, say you go to the right a little bit, it'll give you a little less cultural capital, but you can go really down to the bottom and you have a little less cultural capital, but almost no economic capital, for example. So there's a whole range of precise locations you can be here. Well, what is this telling us? This is telling us that depending upon your economic capital and your cultural capital, you tend to prefer different types of food. It's an aesthetic taste, right? So, I mean, we can think about this in terms of health outcomes if you like, but look at those with low economic capital down here and low cultural capital, fast food and lunch trucks. Now, you might take some offense to this, but this is based upon empirical data. So, so we have to be attentive to it. Like, I'll give you a personal example of why I'm trying not to be judgmental about whether this is good or bad, because I remember one time I was at Queen's University and I was making fun of the sort of food that my dad tends to eat all the time. He eats this and that, and then I got called out for complaining about that, because, you know, my dad's working class, and who am I to be snobby about what he eats, whether he eats hot dogs or whatever the heck he's eating. So let's look at high economic capital and high cultural capital. In the top left, you can see Michelin star chefs, macchiato, a type of coffee, of course. And as you move up, organic, slow cooking, active cultures. And as you move cultural capital but low economic capital, you can see canned beer, drip coffee, cane sugar, and Low cultural capital, but high economic capital. You can see multigrain, frappuccinos, red wine. Okay, that's good enough. It's just meant to give you an example. And if you're really interested, you can go look at his book because he's got all these things charted out. You can see like what type of sports people like based on their class positions, and what type of clothing and where they shop, and all of this various things. It's very interesting because we take it for granted. Like, what type of art do you like? Well, studies seem to suggest, and in Canada, I would say this is evidently true just by going to art museums in a rural setting versus, say, in a metropolitan setting. In a rural art museum, I tend to see, for example, that a lot of the local artists and a lot of the art that's appreciated tends to be more of a realist type of art. Like, I went to an art exhibit in St. John, New Brunswick, and the art was all realist with just subtle abstraction, because there was a real resistance to abstraction, which was considered to be snobby of the city. But I returned not long ago from a museum in Brooklyn, New York, and Manhattan. I went to two, and both of them were very abstract, very abstract. I've noticed the one in Brooklyn tend to have a lot more surrealism, which you tend to have more figures there, but even though they're more fluid figures. And the other one was like neo-abstract. I mean, New York is the birthplace of neo-abstract expressionism. So it tells you a little something what your art preference is. You might think to yourself, oh, that art is just beautiful because I just happen to like it. Well, what Bourdieu is trying to convince you of is it's not actually natural that you are mostly attracted to the type of art that you're attracted to. It has everything to do with your class position. Okay, let's move on. One of the major problems among the working poor and the working class in terms of parenting is, of course, childcare, and that's what we've been focusing on today. The reason for this is that low-skilled jobs have what one author in our text calls non-standard features. I'm slowly starting to wind down. Low-skilled jobs have what one author calls non-standard features. These non-standard features might include, for example, non-standard work schedules, probably the most important one that we're going to focus on. These could include fluctuations in the work schedule, and these fluctuations, research demonstrates, are linked to mental distress, marital discord, instability, poor health outcomes for couples as well as children. They're linked with mental health problems and behavioral problems in children, for example. I quote the author of chapter 30, "The evidence is equivocal that non-standard schedules have negative implications for parent-child interactions." It's equivocal, which means there's no debating it. But there's also evidence that many working class or working poor people seek non-standard jobs or non-standard work schedules as a way to avoid paying the high cost of childcare. Each parent will alternate their childcare, right? As we've been saying, which means that we often don't choose what's best for us, first off, but it also should lead us to ask a question about what's happening in time 3, where non-standard work schedules are pervasive and becoming ever more pervasive. What does that mean for our health outcomes? As we already know, it means quite a bit. And we have to be attentive to it before we all have to pay the price. So, childcare centers and preschools have prearranged weekday and daytime hours. I know this because when I came here to North Bay, I immediately sought out some childcare services, and none of them satisfied my needs because my schedule's all over the place. Like, I need what you might call just-in-time childcare. Like, I know 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before that, I'm going on a trip to New York, or, I'm going here, I have this. But of course, preschools and childcare centers don't work like that. certainly not in a rural setting. I couldn't find a single one that worked like that here. So they're rarely opened on the weekends or late evenings, for example. They're almost never a just-in-time service. So it's not surprising that those who work on call, who work on the weekends, whose shifts constantly change, who work in the evenings, who only know their schedule within a span of a week or two, or perhaps even a few days, they have to turn to an alternative source of childcare, typically something like a babysitter or a family member, more often than not, to help with their childcare. A study from the University of Chicago examined these non-standard situations of employment and childcare. I'm not going to get into all the methodological framings of that study. You can just look at it yourself if you're interested, but I'm just going to jump ahead to the findings. And what the study found, again, this is in Chicago, United States, was that non-standard employment is prevalent among the working class and the working poor. Very important. Non-standard employment is prevalent among the working class and the working poor. That includes such things as ambiguous employment status. I'll write these because I think they're somewhat important. Like having an ambiguous employment status. Also scheduling instabilities, which has to do with non-standard work schedules. So if we're talking about ambiguous employment statuses, then we're pointing at the fact that, we have these designations in Canada and the United States and in a lot of Western countries between part-time and full-time employment. As a status, you can be either a part-time employee or you can be a full-time employee. But what the study found in Chicago is that your status, your employment status as either being part-time or full-time, did not seem to correspond with the amount of hours that people were working. Policies distinguish part-time and full-time job statuses among employees, and these are regulated at the governmental level and then picked up at the institutional level. Well, the Chicago study found that an employee's employment status, being either full-time or part-time, bore little resemblance to the number of hours they were actually working. What it means is that this is really significant because a part-time worker might actually be working full-time hours or even beyond full-time hours. And a full-time worker might be working less than full-time hours. I know this because as I'm saying this, I'm remembering when I was in my first or second year of university, I was working at a call center in New Brunswick. And I remember that it said I was part-time, but I was working like 40 something hours a week. And I remember asking my boss, like, why is it listed part-time, but I'm working this amount? Why don't you list me as full-time? I don't get it. Now I'm starting to understand. New Brunswick has historically had very lax labor laws. So 80% of part-time workers in this study were working more than 35 hours per week. That's full-time. If we're measuring strictly in terms of the time commitment, the question then becomes, why do organizations, institutions use that distinction between part-time and full-time? And why are they using it in that way where part-time employees are working full-time hours? Well, the author argues that these statuses, and the author of this chapter who was looking at this study was in discussions with human resource representatives. So, they got the inside scoop. These statuses function primarily to define an employee's access to benefits, education, training. We're talking about health benefits, for example. Part-time workers are often excluded from formal skill development and training opportunities and health benefits and time off benefits and so on. So you can greatly reduce a lot of that stuff by putting people into a part-time category. We also have the interesting paradox where, holding a job may also not actually mean that you're working for the company. Now that seems really confusing. You're on paper, you're still employed, but you're not actually working for them. It's a really strange finding. At a given job, you may be working a minimum number of hours, but this minimum threshold is not often defined. So you could be getting 0 hours and still be employed. So instead of laying people off, a lot of companies in this study in Chicago, and we can imagine how much of this is happening elsewhere, they simply adjust their hours and instead of laying people off. And sometimes that implies bringing people's work hours down to 0. So the reasons that they cite for this are things like, market fluctuations or business, changing business conditions. There's all this verbiage you still hear even to this day of the changing nature of our business. Therefore, hours are reduced temporarily, this sort of thing. You have no protections in this case, right? So it ultimately means market conditions. When the company begins to lose money, they pull it out of you. So it can lead to very lengthy gaps in employment for those who are nonetheless on paper still employed by the company, but also you can't get benefits or you can't get employment insurance or something like that if you're still technically employed. I'm not sure what the rules are on that, actually. I'd have to go back and look, but I can imagine it can lead to all kinds of complications because there's this ambiguity there. One HR person who was interviewed in the study said, I'm quoting, "Instead of laying people off, we keep them on the payroll so that they can continue to be covered by insurance and to gain seniority. They just don't get any hours," end quote. Okay, what does it mean for childcare ultimately? Well, implications for ambiguous employment status or statuses produces as a consequence ambiguous outcomes in childcare needs for employers. So ambiguity like this creates childcare scheduling demands that are not easily accommodated by the market, by childcare services, by childcare subsidies, by preschools, by centers, and so on. It has implications at the level of policy because it's not clear that policy is designed to assist these low-income parents with childcare. Eligibility for childcare is often linked to employment status in most states in the United States anyway. I'd have to look into more the Canadian example, which offhand I don't know. Another major related issue, and the other one I mentioned, was scheduling instability. There's just what I've been calling just-in-time scheduling, which means that the employer is passing their market fluctuations or their fluctuations in consumer demand directly onto the employees, unloading those burdens onto the employees. So just-in-time strategies minimize in the short term labor costs. So, for example, many retailers have a policy of determining their staffing levels based on preceding weeks or years' sales, and often it's broken down hour by hour. I remember a very long time ago, I worked at McDonald's as a manager, and when we were doing staffing, we had trends from all previous years to know how many people we should have on the floor at a given time. It's that exact sort of mentality. In Chicago, many of the sales associates, for example, in the study were given as little as 2 days notice of what their schedules were going to be. There's also fluctuating hours. You can go from working overtime to working in a downtime period, which they can happen based on season, happen week to week, day to day. For example, in the study, one hotel expected its housekeepers to work 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day in the summer, and then they had no scheduled hours in the winter. So all of these things tend to be realities for the working class and the working poor. And it has tremendous implications, as we know. I keep repeating, for childcare. Just in case and last minute childcare is ultimately the consequence of these scheduling dynamics and this ambiguity in employment status. So all that workers can do in this case is to use informal caregivers. I had to go on Kijiji to try and find somebody, and I found somebody, and she helped me out once or twice. And then, I just wasn't working for me. let's just be, it was costing me 3, 4, 5 times the going rate. It was an excessive amount of money. So we can't do it. I'm not exactly at this point the working poor. I admit that I'm a professor, but I nonetheless identify with it because it was the vast majority of my life. Can't do it with preschool. Can't do it with childcare centers because they require constant scheduling in advance, predictable scheduling. And we know that time management is now a major issue, particularly in time 3. So 60% of the people in the study were relying upon secondary arrangements in addition to the primary caregiver. They had a whole assortment of options at a given time. They had childcare of various types, and not just one that they could rely on. So having multiple childcare arrangements was absolutely universal in the study, according to the authors. Some of them reported up to 4 different childcare arrangements that they dealt with on a regular basis. So you can see how the market, I'm coming to a close now. You can see how the market, the capitalist market and the nature of business is responsible for changing our social relationships in space and time. These more dynamic fluctuations in the market, particularly the working poor and the working classes, have disastrous consequences on families. And those trends are increasing. And they're becoming even more complicated at the time of what I'm calling implosion. For a while, we were, of course, discussing within sociology the McJob, which was a type, I know McDonald's was really upset at this phrase for quite a long time. I think they even did something to try and get it out of the dictionary, but I'm not sure the history on that. You might want to Google it. But the McJob, which was a type of employment, not just working at McDonald's. The McJob was a type of job where the expectation was that you were working there as just a temporary stage in your employment career. Of course, many people got locked into the McJob cycles. You work here, then you quit and you work another McJob, and you go from McJob to McJob in a cycle, instead of using it as a platform to advance, which was how it was originally sold by, say, McDonald's. So you would get the job only temporarily and with very few benefits, and the company, McDonald's, for example, knows up front that you're just passing through for a short time. So today, to what extent are all jobs variations on McJobs? I'm just going to open this up as a question, and as a way of ending today's class. To what extent do McJobs still exist? Today, we talk a lot about the gig economy, for example. Is there a movement from the McJob world to the gig economy? What is a gig economy? I know I spelled it wrong here, forgive me. I'm not going to go fix it now. The gig economy is an extension of the McJob to a dominant sociological principle. It's what one anarchist anthropologist who passed away not long ago, he was a friend of mine, and it bothers me that he passed, named David Graeber. He referred to in one of his last works as bullshit jobs. Are we now at the level of the bullshit job? It's an open question, and I don't think Graeber got all the dimensions to this that he could have. He misses some things, but I do think he's pointing at something significant here. What are bullshit jobs? Well, I'm going to quote him. A bullshit job, let's change the font. Okay. A bullshit job is a form of employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obligated to pretend that this is not the case. So a bullshit job is a job that you disavow. I love the word disavow because it has important clinical implications, but I think it's a cultural logic in the American context. Disavow is a way of negating something while affirming it. We're forced into pretending we feel obligated, so we pretend that we enjoy our job. Maybe you're a barista at a particular coffee shop. Maybe you work the cash at McDonald's. Maybe you deliver food. Maybe you do enjoy it too. This is just David Graeber's argument, right? But he claims these are bullshit jobs. And he's claiming that they're bullshit jobs because they're forms of employment that are completely pointless, unnecessary, and pernicious, except to extract surplus value, except to extract money from those who are running the apps or the platforms or the business model. So what are these bullshit jobs? Well, Graeber claims that there's 5 of them that we should be particularly aware of. I'll just list them and tell you about them, then stop. The first one he calls flunkies. Flunkies are jobs, and you can find some brief write-ups about this on the internet if you want to study it a bit more deeply too, but flunkies are jobs that serve only to make the bosses, the managers, the superiors feel important. So they're kind of service level or secondary accommodations for a supervisor. So we're thinking of things like reception, administrative assistant, door attendants, the person who pushes the elevator button. That's a serious big job in India, by the way. Everywhere you go, somebody's there to control the escalators, to control the buttons, and so on. So those are what Graeber calls flunkies. Then there's goons. These are people who ultimately their responsibility is to oppose other people who also are goons. And he's talking about political lobbyists or lobbyists of various kinds, lobbying government, for example, corporate lawyers, telemarketers, public relations specialists, and so on. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm trying to go as fast as I can to finish up here. Sorry. He calls the next duct tapers. Duct tapers, we don't need to get caught up into what this list is, by the way. I'm just trying to give you some awareness of what some of these people are talking about. Duct tapers are people who are involved in pragmatically fixing things up. They don't actually provide a viable, sustainable solution, but they'll fix things up just to make a quick buck. Just that's duct tape, right? So you can think of a computer programmer who comes just to make your code a bit more efficient or to make one program do something just a little bit different. Airline desk staff is another example he gives here, whose role is basically to calm passengers down only. Or, I was thinking of, in some sense, telemarketers are also duct tapers, not telemarketers, but call center workers, because it's like, I used to do this for a very long time. And I remember a general feeling among my peers who were also working there that basically our job was to just quietly, calmly, patiently allow people to scream at us so that they didn't scream to the people that were higher above us. So we would just be shock absorbers, So they'd call, they say, I want to talk to your manager. And we had the right to say, oh, I'm a manager. We weren't. And what is a manager there anyway? The manager is not really a manager. He's working on contract for the call center company that's just happens to be hired by Bell or Rogers or whomever, right? So duct tapers. Marriage therapists are another one he claims. I don't know. You can buy this or you can't. That's totally okay. 4 are what he calls box tickers. It's clever. Box tickers are survey administrators, corporate compliance officers. You might ask yourself, to what extent does your university education encourage you to be a box ticker, to make sure you satisfy all the things that the professor asks you to satisfy so you can get the grades, so that you can get the courses you need to get the degree and so on, tick all the boxes. Finally, there's the taskmaster, which includes things like middle management, leadership professionals. The taskmasters are those who, according to Graeber, are responsible for ultimately producing nonsense work often to create the appearance that something significant is happening, that you're covering yourself in terms of liability, and so on. Like, for example, who is responsible at a university for making sure there's available workshops for teaching assistants or for professors for professional development or something like that? Graeber might consider that to be taskmaster type of job. Again, we can agree or disagree with this. The overall point is that Graeber's saying that the movement from McJobs to a gig economy to bullshit jobs adds to it a level at which we're supposed to pretend that we have a cool job, and we're supposed to really love it, even though we don't love it at the same time. There's this mechanism of disavowal. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to wish you all the best for this week. Please stay in contact with me if you need help with anything that includes extra time, thinking about what you're going to do for your assignments, anything at all. I'm happy to respond just as quickly as I possibly can. And I really hope you're doing okay as we come to the end of this very difficult semester for all of you. Be well. Bye-bye.